some 200 years, going back to Adam, his invisible hand has become the cliche metaphor for the stability of markets. That invisible hand supposedly guides prices and outputs into equilibrium. When markets are stable, errors in prices or in production decisions trigger negative, that is, deviation counteracting feedbacks, and thus are automatically corrected. Bad decisions lead to losses and good ones to profit. Market fundamentalists' doctrines presume that the economy is structured in such a manner that this is always true. But the structure within which market interactions work themselves out is a creation of lawyers and politicians in the past, and as all human creations comes with no guarantee of serving us well for all time, so it is not always true. In a crisis such as the recent one, we observe instability. It is not a simple instability. It has involved several interlinked deviation amplifying processes that are simultaneously at work. The point I want to make is that when unstable processes take over, many old economic verities cease to apply, and some of them are turned on their heads. Let me try to do something about this. Volume. Now, a few data will suffice to illustrate how dramatic were the instabilities unleashed in the recent crisis. The losses incurred in the US subprime mortgages as of March of this year are estimated at roughly $160 billion. You might add a similar estimate for Alt-A losses of $73 billion. I should say that I thank Andy Haldane for all these numbers. Now, those losses have been widely cited as the proximate cause of the deep recession. We should note, I suppose, that treating them as such implies the belief that none of them was rationally expected ahead of time and thus already discounted by the markets. That may not be altogether true, but the point in the present context is that that figure of $233 billion would set an upper limit to the shock impinging on the global financial system, if we believe this story about causation. Now, what am I doing to this thing? So there are these numbers, okay? Let's try this again. I don't seem to be able to operate this thing very well. Okay, the combined losses of income over the last 2 years in the US, the UK, and Euro area together come to a sum of approximately, sum that's approximately 50 times larger than what we have cited as the cause. And the losses in asset values at the low point of the market some time ago now was a bit more than 50 times larger than that figure. Then we can talk about the resources committed to stopping the free fall of the system, right? And here you have the change in the deficits. Of course, that's partly endogenous, but these figures are still a lot larger than the presumed cause. The money creation by the three central banks are enormous, and to that we could add the guarantees, the insurance, the capital injections committed by the governments. And you see that all of these figures are at least one order of magnitude bigger than what's supposed to be the shock. So this amplification, this great amplification of the disturbance is, I think, what we should be mainly concerned about. The principle, what I see as the key variable in this amplification is leverage. We have a number of destabilizing feedback mechanisms that were interactive in the amplification, but at the core was the problem of leverage, particularly of financial institutions, but not exclusively financial institutions. It has increased enormously over recent decades. In the United States, financial sector liabilities were a little bit less than 20% of our year's GDP back in the 1970s. Today, the figure is close to 120%. In the United Kingdom, the ratio has also more than quintupled in those 40 years. Now, high leverage, of course, means high risk of insolvency, but it also means high returns as long as the going is good. And as long as the going is good, it also means high return to people working in this industry. The rate of return, I don't have the figures to show you, but they are in the papers. Now, the first point I now want to make is that financial crisis has triggered much discussions about how to regulate the mortgage market, to regulate securitization in general, credit derivatives in particular, and so on. But these are important issues, but they are really secondary. The primary problem has been relatively neglected in these discussions. We might make the mortgage market perfectly transparent and render all its participants financially responsible for their actions and so on, only to find that the unstable system will crash for an entirely different reason the next time. So this is what has to be the first priority, to deal with the instability of the system. Now, as several speakers have said before me, the economy I also want to say that instability is also the important problem for economics, not just for the economy. Much that is true when the economy is stable ceases to be true when it's not. And economics hasn't particularly paid attention to this fact, mostly because we tend to assume that stability rules all the time. Now, we're dealing with a complex system. And I want to make a sketch of what I think it is like. Right? So you have to imagine the state space first for the market sector. Right? And I divide it roughly into 3 regions. Right? In the first region, things are normal. Negative feedback controls dominate. Stabilization policies are not particularly useful. Right? In region 2, you have some destabilizing adaptive feedbacks, but these are fairly tightly bounded, like the Keynesian multiplier. They are not enormous. And the Keynesian accelerator and so on. And in this region, quite conventional stabilization policies may be useful. Now, I want to talk mostly about region 3. And in region 3, you have a number of interactive positive feedback processes. So region 3 is my house of horrors, really. For example, high leverage combined with extreme maturity mismatches in the financial sector, so that small losses freeze the markets. Then you have some institutional things that make it worse. If you impose MTM accounting and Basel rules, that adds pressure to deleverage just when you don't want it. Attempts by some banks to deleverage damage the balance sheets of all banks and will strangle lending to the real sector. It will threaten default avalanches in highly connected networks. And the recession then undermines the ability of the real sector to service debts to banks and so on. And the worst part of this region 3 is the black hole of Fisherian debt deflation, where the decline of flexible prices, as people desperately try to reduce the debts, actually increase the real value of the debts. Right? And a quick state space sketch for the public sector. Region 1, the normality one, is where you have budget surpluses or sustainable deficits. Region 2, deficits, but by the fair measure of control by the government. So you have the models of expected inflation with a Fisher premium on the interest rates and so on. But region 3 here is where control of the deficit has been lost. Short-term inflation expectations become extremely volatile, responding to day-to-day news. Medium and long-term expectations are too ill-defined to support intertemporal markets of any kind. So the entire financial structure essentially disappears. Now, I will not deal. Yeah, I spent some years working on high inflations and so on with Daniel Heyman, but I won't talk about it more here. Now, between these two sectors, and of course I should have a foreign sector too, but that becomes too much. Obviously, the two sectors interact in various ways. And one such interaction is particularly germane here. First, recall Minsky's explanation of the endogenous evolution of fragility. That will happen in Minsky whether or not the government is in the picture. A long period of tranquility will make the financial sector develop the fragility all on its own. But as Bill White and George Soros have emphasized already in this conference, and Haldane has also been writing about it, the Minsky tendency has been systematically exacerbated by central bank policies over the last 3 decades or more, by the Greenspan put and so on, that have removed the downside risk in the system and therefore created incentives to higher and higher leverage and more instability in the system. Some points about my region 3. First, and I think this is important to realize how far from conventional economics we are, is that what is at the bottom of the process that carries you into my region 3 is that you have violations of intertemporal budget constraints on a big scale. That is true in both of the region 3 sectors. In the deflationary crisis case, the violations of the budget constraints are by the private sector. In the high inflation case, it's the government who does not obey the equal value in exchange over time. So in a financial crisis of either kind, dislocations of the balance sheets are large. And as a consequence, in region 3, and here I hark back to Richard Koo as well as Bill White, in this region 3, it's the conditions of balance sheets that dominate the system's dynamics if you don't intervene to change it. And the problem with that, of course, is that repairing balance sheets can take a very long time. And that last point is what makes me pessimistic, even when I read all the current press reports from Larry Summers and others say it's all over, we are back, happy days are here again, and so on. It's not going to be that easy. Now, with those comments of mine as a background, 3 comments about currently dominating macro. What's wrong with dynamic stochastic general equilibrium theory? Well, number 1, it assumes stability. It assumes, even when in some versions it assumes multiple equilibria. It assumes the economy will home in on one of those equilibria and it will be Walrasian. Number 2, and this is true of standard Keynesian theory too, it assumes that the balance sheets are on track. That is, that the balance sheets are evolving along some sort of equilibrium path or not very far away from it. And you only need to worry about the flows and not about the stocks. And my third point, which I consider critical, it assumes budget constraint violations are of little or no consequence, so that you can ignore them. And I think each one of these are errors that is crippling on its own, in its own right. Now another parenthesis, more or less. The synthesis between new classical dynamic stochastic general equilibrium theory and so-called the new Keynesian dynamic stochastic general equilibrium theory assumes that you can deal with any stability problem as if the economy actually is a stable general equilibrium system. That is, one which always tends to home in on a general equilibrium. But since you observe unemployment and other problems, you have to invoke frictions of some sort or another. So the system is inherently stable, but it tends to go to the right place. But there are imperfections that, if you could remove them, would put you back in the Garden of Eden. So these imperfections or inflexibilities, not asymmetries of information, but the inflexibilities, are supposed to be present in the short run, but vanish with the passage of time. In region 3, I think, at least, what is important in the short run is not this friction, it's the instabilities that are the basic problem. And in that region, high degrees of flexibility, that is, if frictions were to disappear entirely, it would be catastrophical, because what? It would take you into the Fisherian black hole. So I think this cliché thinking about an equilibrium system with frictions that are important in the short run but not in the long run has it almost backwards. In the short run, at least in today's context, the problem is instability of the system, or rather the instability of several processes at work at the same time that interact. in the long run, I think that we are dealing with something you could call inflexibilities or frictions, if you will, that are preventing the adjustment in the system in such a way that very, very large imbalances build up over time that are bound to sooner or later throw us into region 3. And some of these are some of these are due to governments. For example, the fixing of exchange rates that lead to the build-up of large imbalances between countries. But of course also the inflexibility of our fiscal policies that lock us into expenditure patterns and taxation, expenditures, commitments and taxation that we cannot maintain indefinitely. Sooner or later we'll have to pay for our public goods. Now, when I at the last minute made up this PowerPoint, I was told I had 20 minutes, and I said, I don't have the time to go through that. So I left it blank. You will be able to get this little paper later. So this is one lesson where you have to do your homework later. Regulation, not much to teach you either. I do want to say one thing. There are sort of two approaches to regulation that I want to contrast. Okay? One is one that takes for granted whatever the incentives are facing the people, the actors in the financial markets, and says we can't let them act on these incentives the way things are. So we have to hem them around with either quantitative regulations or possibly tax certain of their activities in such a way as to prevent them essentially from acting the way they otherwise would. Well, the problem with that is that it proves extremely difficult to keep one step ahead of the innovations in the financial markets that are designed to circumvent such things. So what is the alternative? Well, the one I want to mention is my own pet scheme, is to operate directly on the incentives. And what I have in mind is to reintroduce liability for the agents in the financial markets. And the particular scheme would be one in which you require that at the higher level of the banks, a certain proportion of remuneration should always be in the form of shares in the bank, but shares of a particular kind that would carry double liability, so that if the firm goes under, not only do the people lose the value of their shares, they also have a liability equivalent to the face value of the shares. And that, I think, would change incentives within financial institutions. It would also change the incentives for how you structure financial institutions. If you think of the executives, the high-level executives of AIG, for example, if they had all had double liability, I think many of them might have shown a lively interest in the activities of that London unit that were selling default swaps for many billions of dollars, right? And the fact that if you had this liability rule, and remember, it's not that very long ago that the investment banks were partnerships, right? So this is historically speaking, this is not very radical. At one time, we did have double liability for shareholders in American banking, and way back, we had unlimited liability in banking. So it's not completely taken out of there. Anyway, the fact that with that rule in effect, people inside the banks would take a lively interest in the activities of divisions for which they were not directly responsible, would create a disincentive to conglomerate banking and might make the banks shed some lines of business just for this, to get rid of the internal troubles that this would create. Okay, let me get to my last point. One of the things wrong with economics today is the fences we have erected against other social sciences. And it blinds us sometimes to what we are really doing when we are talking, for example, now of stabilization policy. To put it briefly, it's a little bit longer in the paper. The budget constraint of economic models embodies a social, a legal, and an ethical rule. Also, we think of it just as an equation. And that rule is equal value in exchange, as agreed to by two parties in exchange. A lot in economics depends upon that budget constraint really being binding, that it's obeyed at all times. Certainly all the efficiency properties that we claim for general equilibrium system, for example, obviously depends on those budget constraints. As a matter of fact, it's difficult to do general equilibrium economics if you don't assume that the budget constraints hold. But also for a market fundamentalist, let's say, for Milton Friedman or somebody like that, he would know that the market as a system of voluntary cooperation depends on this social, legal, and ethical rule being obeyed. Now, in my region 3, what we have is the wholesale violation of budget constraints, which is, to repeat, a wholesale violation of social, legal, ethical rules that people have incorporated in their daily life and seldom give much reflection, but which we obey habitually. And when they are broken in a large scale, the way it becomes apparent to people first, perhaps, that something has gone completely wrong with the incidence of gains and losses in the economy, is when the ordinary taxpayer has to bail out the big banks and so on. But a little bit more reflection makes the ordinary citizen realize that the system having gone wrong didn't start with financial crash. That in the build-up, in the long period of apparent prosperity, where the system was getting more and more highly levered, it was already true that implicitly these rules on which the exchange system depends have been not abandoned, but violated. Now, the incidence of gains and losses, once you're in region 3, just do not make sense to ordinary people. And so they get disoriented and they get very angry. And that creates a social milieu, which is one where demagogues gain influence and where it becomes extremely difficult to form a social agreement about how to deal with the difficulties that face us. And you can see that in politics right now. Thank you.